Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Recovery Talk. I hope you like my new cover design. I don't know why I wanted to put my face on my podcast. I was a little bit hesitant to do that, but I wanted to make it like a little bit more personal. Kind of remind you that there is actually a person behind this voice, right? Through my podcast and social media, I'm always, having this balance of how much do I make it about myself versus how much do I make it about the cause, right? And I don't want to make it about myself, but I also want to show that I'm, a person. So you kind of, feel like you're not listening to a robot talk. But I also don't want to make my story and experience kind of like put that at the forefront, right? I use that experience but without making it just about my story. And I also feel like my story is one that's been told so many times before that, it's just a very stereotypical story, right? Do we need to hear that story again and again and again, right? And I think that's why I'm more focused on, the actual like science behind it rather than just retelling my story times and times again. But I'm, of course, using my experience, lived experience when I am talking about eating disorders, but I'm just being mindful that my story is not everyone's story, right? And I'm also looking at the science, not just this is how it was like for me, so this is definitely how it will be like for you, because that's not the case. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of things that happen in recovery that kind of seem to happen across the board, right? There are certain very common phenomena. And one of them is something I'm going to talk about today, a very common phenomena that happens to a lot of people. Not all, but a lot of people. And that is this identification with eating disorder and then this feeling of a loss of identity with recovery and a bit of an emptiness and identity crisis even. I think this can be a little bit taboo because when you say that someone can over-identify with their suffering and their illness, that can sometimes come across in a little bit of almost like a victim blamey way, right? Like, oh, you're just identifying too much with this illness. Like that is, can you see how that can be a little bit of a tricky way of framing it, right? That kind of implies that the other person should just stop identifying so much with their illness and then they'll be, then they'll be healthy, right? So that is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying more is the fact that an eating disorder, due to the nature of an eating disorder, it's very, very all-consuming. And therefore, it is almost impossible for it not to be some part of your identity. It could be internal, that it essentially is how you kind of see yourself, like it's your internal, what can I say, your internal identity, or it could be more external, where, for instance, you are well known for being, the one that loves going to the gym, the one that always eats, quote unquote, healthy or ethical, or eating a specific way, or having a specific body type, or being, the anorexic one, the fitness one, whatsoever, any kind of identity that other people can kind of identify you with, right, from the eating disorder. Or it could be both internal and external, where that's kind of how you see yourself and how other people see you, and that makes it really terrifying to choose recovery because you know that there are parts of your identity you would have to let go of to pursue full recovery. I see this a lot, especially in people who have eating disorders that are often like socially encouraged and socially acceptable. So for instance, if someone is very like orthorexic, very into fitness, and they might experience that this is being praised, at least by some people, and that can be difficult for them to let go of because it is an applauded behavior. But this can also happen to someone who have an eating disorder that is not applauded, right? So for example, someone might be very sick and maybe they will be, visibly sick. And I say this a little bit like, because you can't usually tell if someone has an eating disorder by looking at them, right? But if someone is visibly underweight, being the visibly underweight person can be something that is for them part of their identity, because it's kind of how they feel like others see them, even though others may not see it as like a favorable thing and be like, whoa, you're so thin, good job, even though that can happen as well. But even if other people are seeing it as, and wow, I'm concerned about you, this can be, being that, sickly thin person can also be an identity. So again, this can happen in so many different ways. It can be identity towards someone's body, identity towards someone's eating behavior, towards someone's movement, or towards just someone's interests, right? This is another thing. We know that an eating disorder tends to cause an increased interest in food, cooking, baking, etc., and also tends to create a sense of rigidity around, someone's how they schedule their day, how so things such as just being more rigid, scheduled, needing to plan everything, and also things such as being very, very introverted and completely disinterested in certain things. For example, you see, this does not go for all people with eating disorders, but some people with eating disorders would become extremely socially withdrawn and also would completely lose interest, for instance, in dating. And again, I'm not saying that this not being interested in dating is always something to be pathologized, because asexuality is a thing, right? But there's a difference between asexuality as a sexual orientation versus kind of medically induced asexuality in a person that's not normally asexual. And that's a very important separation, because these are very different things. I definitely fell into that group that had no interest except for my eating disorder and food, didn't want to do anything or see anyone. And don't get me wrong, I am an introvert. I am someone who likes being in my own space. But that just became so extreme during my eating disorder that I was just convinced that I was completely asocial, asexual, all of those things. And I see this a lot. And then I started recovery, right? And then I started getting those desire to connect with people that kind of came back. And for me, I didn't have that during eating disorder. Again, many people with eating disorder, that does not disappear. It's just something that for some people, the isolation is becomes a big thing. And even if it doesn't, you don't become completely a social recluse, you might still notice that your relationships are suffering. So basically, I kind of created my, internal identity, how I saw myself as a person that don't need other people, that don't want to be around other people. And then when I started getting urges, to get friends, have a partner, go outside the house at least maybe once a week, that was whoa, who is this? So it's interesting with identity and eating disorders, because for me personally, this is my personal experience. I was horrified by the thought of someone thinking of me as the anorexic girl, right? And I remember I had that conversation with a family member where they were saying yeah, that's kind of how people around you are talking about you and seeing you right now. And that was devastating for me. I did not want to be the anorexic girl. That was not how I wanted people to remember me or see me. And yeah, for me, that was connected with a lot of shame, because that was not in alignment with how I wanted to be perceived or see myself. But then for other people, this identity is not something that gives them this panic that it did with me. That identity might give them some comfort, and it might be how they feel safe being perceived and perceiving themselves, and letting go of being the sick one can then be very challenging. Because the illness can sometimes become almost like a shield, right? It becomes a shield to protect you, but actually this shield just locks you inside. It is not helping you, it's harming you. I touched upon some of this in my last 2 episodes, the one about the food scarcity mindset and food rigidity and perfectionism, and also the one I did on veganism, this whole thing with identity and how this certain habits and preferences in terms of how someone lives their lifestyle could be related to the eating disorder, and realizing that and being whoa, well, who am I then? And again, this is not to say that all of these things always are related to the eating disorder. There are people who really enjoy baking, and it has nothing to do with their eating disorder. But I would say that any kind of major identity shift or urge or interest that coincidentally happened with the eating disorder should probably be investigated. So for example, if you were someone who didn't really have much interest in cooking, but then your eating disorder just turned you into Martha Stewart, maybe that is something to investigate before you kind of identify yourself as, a foodie or a chef or whatsoever. Or if you're someone who was very much, a sexual person before your eating disorder, and then your eating disorder just completely turned you off sex, then that could be worth kind of investigating before thinking, oh yeah, I'm just asexual. But if these things were present beforehand, that's a different story. And of course, even if something is present beforehand, it can be good to be aware that an eating disorder can strengthen it, right? So I mentioned before my eating disorder, I was always an introvert. I'm still an introvert, but the way the eating disorder strengthened that was that I isolated myself for, I think there was a year where I didn't see anyone outside of my closest family. I was completely isolated. So anyhow, Let's talk a bit about what to do when you are in recovery and you're realizing that certain things that you thought was part of who you are as a person turns out to be a byproduct of the eating disorder. What do you do? So I think something that a lot of people do when they experience this is that they panic, right? They panic and they get really like bitter. They're like, I have wasted so much time on this and that. And I just want to remind you that, it's okay, right? You can't go back and change the past. That was then, now is now. What you can do is you can change what you're doing in the future, right? Just because you spent a lot of time making a mistake doesn't mean that you need to hold on to that mistake and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. So try and think that that was who you were then, but is it who you are now? And I see some other people, what they do is getting incredibly defensive and then kind of doubling down on whatever it was that they were realizing was kind of must be a little bit eating disorder related, right? So for instance, imagine if someone is super into fitness, right? And then they're realizing, oh, this coincided with my eating disorder or my recovery. Did I move from one obsession to another? No. And then they go on these mental gymnastics about why it's not the case for them, even though they know the shoe fit, because they noticed they got a strong reaction from listening to it. And I think that could be a good indication that is something to investigate. If you notice that you get an extremely strong reaction, or you get urges to get very defensive, that could be something worth investigating, because if it's hysterical, it's often historical. But again, it's not really my job to tell you this is the disordered behavior. This is not, because that is something you yourself have to work on, ideally with a therapist where you can go together and like investigate these things. So I'm not here to tell you what to do or what not to do. I'm just here to talk about identity as someone who's gone through it and someone who work with people who are going through that, recovery identity crisis. Because what I'm saying, these things I'm saying, this is not things I'm just taking from thin air, right? These are like traits that have been shown in scientific studies. So for example, the Minnesota starvation study, which is probably my favorite study on eating disorders that was not meant to be an eating disorder study. If you haven't listened to my episode on the Minnesota starvation study, do check it out, where I'm explaining the study and why it's so important and so fascinating. In that study, they noticed the behavioral changes in the participants, right? So for example, increase in introversion, decrease in sex drive, increase interest in food and cooking, and some of them actually became chefs after the study. And also there's been doing a lot of studies about how hunger affects like kind of like a nation or a people, when there is like a state of famine in a country, how this affects the population and how they become more passive, right? Because there is like a primal need, which is the need for food to survival, that is not being met, right? And that kind of, you kind of don't care that much about other things. And this is also something I see a lot in people with eating disorders, where things that for most people would create an emotional reaction does not necessarily create an emotional reaction. So they can be quite apathetic to a lot of things. But then when someone ate their yogurt that they were going to have, then you have a strong reaction, right? And we also know statistically, again, just statistically, that there is a huge, percentage of people who have or have had an eating disorder that are vegetarian or vegan. Again, does not mean that every vegetarian or vegan have or have had an eating disorder. I'm just saying that there is a strong correlation there statistically. And we also know that an eating disorder is, for some people, not all, again, not the case for me actually, but for a lot of people, it's related to an increased interest in exercise and urges to move and body dysmorphia. And this is kind of self-explanatory how this can manifest in, getting very into fitness, because then, trying to solve your body dysmorphia with something that essentially triggers more body dysmorphia, and you get your urges to move, you do that, you kind of get those urges out of the system in the gym, right? Even though ironically, they don't really go out of the system. They just temporarily feel like you've eased it, and then it worsens, right? It's like itching a mosquito bite. When you're exercising from compulsive urges, it's like itching, like scratching a mosquito bite. Like in the moment, it feels a lot better, but then afterwards, it just gets worse and worse and worse. And the best thing to do is just sit with the itch and don't itch on it. Don't scratch. Okay, so back to what I said. What do you do when you realize that something is the eating disorder? So again, I can kind of split this into two. So first would be, for instance, realizing that a specific interest you have, that could be gym interest, specific food interest, specific lifestyle, is related to eating disorder. The other one would be just letting go of the sick identity. If you're someone who kind of, the way you perceive yourself, other people perceive you as sick. So let's kind of do it in two parts. Let's start with letting go of, a specific interest or hobby that you thought was a hobby, but it turned out to be just a symptom rather than a hobby. So the first thing I hear from a lot of people when I work on them, because I work with clients with this all the time, they're like, what would other people think if, for instance, I stop turning up to CrossFit classes? What would the other people think if I stop being a vegan? What would people think? I get that all the time. And, first of all, I want to remind you, most people don't. They don't think. Most people are so in their own heads, they're not really going to notice, or if they notice, they're not really going to care that much if your body was changing, you stopped going to the gym, you change the way you eat. People don't really care. Honestly, you would be surprised how little people care about you. And that can be a scary thing or it can be a relieving thing. I think it's the biggest relief is that most people don't really care that much. That is, for me, a massive relief. I say this as someone who got quite a big following online. Even in my case, people, even though I have some really nosy people, but still, even in my case, most people don't really care that much, And here's the thing. Hypothetically, if they did, imagine, so first of all, they don't, but if they were to care, so what? Would your option then be to live your life with an eating disorder or disordered behavior that is not in alignment with you, just to satisfy John at the gym because you feel like he might judge you if not? You can't live your life for other people's perception of you, What a waste. Imagine spending your one life on this planet being, let's say, following a specific way of eating because you're scared that if you stop following this way of eating, some person that's probably not thinking about you is going to think about you or judge you. That's no. And I'm not one of those people that say, stop caring what other people think, because honestly, wanting human approval and human, wanting to feel accepted is a completely normal part of being a human, I feel like a lot of people, especially Instagram therapists, completely they pathologize this thing, right? It's completely normal to want some approval and belonging, right? But what I'm saying is, if that approval and belonging is determined by you ruining your mental or physical health, is that a healthy approval and belonging? So I think this is more what you need to think, where do you want your approval and belonging from, right? And of course, relying less on it is great. You don't want to over-rely on what other people think. But, think of it this way. So, for instance, in my case, I don't really care what other people think of, for instance, my body. It's not really something that I spend a lot of time feeling like people need to think of my body a certain way. But of course, I'm also saying this with someone who, have I guess, privilege in terms that my body it's quite a socially acceptable body. But still, let's use that as an example. That is not something that I'm very concerned that people will judge me based on, right? But I would be concerned if the people in my life that I love and care about thought I was being mean or thought that I was not being caring, or, these are the things I care about. I care if my clients thought I was doing a shit job. See, these are the kind of approvals I seek. And I think that those kind of approval, those are healthier approvals to seek. Not necessarily that I'm seeking approval from my friends or family or clients, but I want there to be a mutual appreciation, right? What John at the gym thinks of me is not really my concern, right? I don't live to please John at the gym. By the way, John at the gym is someone I'm making up. And here's the thing. I want to feel like I'm being a good friend, a good aunt, daughter, sister, all of these things. I want to feel a good coach. I want to feel those things because that is in alignment with how I see myself and want to be seen, right? I want to be seen as a decent person who does decent work because that is in alignment with my values, right? Being seen as the fittest person in the gym is not really my priority because that is not my value. That is not something I put highly, right? And this is the thing I want to remind you. What traits do you put highly? What do you value in yourself and in other people? And I say in other people because very often I hear this time and time again in clients that in themselves, they're hyper focusing on their own body. And then when they talk about the people in their lives, could be friends, family members, someone they really look up to, someone maybe could even be like someone on the TV or social media that I think are pretty cool. I always ask them, what do you like about this person? Can you say 3 different traits you like about this person? Not once have they said their body. Not once. It's always things such as, oh, how they make me feel, how their style of writing, all of these things. It's just never come up that it is their body or how good, quote unquote, good they are at, eating a specific way or how much they train. That's just never come up. So why would you assume other people would think that way about you? And also, if they were, is that a person that you want to seek approval from? Is that a person that's even worth having in your life? Someone who sees you based on your body or food or exercise regime? Is that really a healthy person to have in your life? So I want you to take a moment to think about that. Like, what are your values? What do you appreciate in other people? What kind of people do you really admire? And what is it about them that you admire? Because very often the things that we really admire in other people are often the things that we that aligns with our values, right? For instance, I really admire people who are, nice and kind and respectful and gentle and, because these are qualities that I feel aligned with my values, I don't like people being assholes. So, this is something that I guess, aspire to. Not that I'm never an asshole. I can, of course, be a bit of an asshole, but you know what I mean, right? So when I go to the park and I see someone, being very nice to a dog and very sweet with a dog, or I see a parent with their child playing, looking very cute, these are things that make me like, oh, it makes me feel good inside, right? And I think this is also a good way to reframe like jealousy or being envious of someone. I always mix up those terms, but basically wanting what someone else have. For example, if I'm in the park and I see someone with a very cute dog that I want, or I see someone with, a parent and child, instead of being jealous that, oh, you have a child or you have a dog, I just think, oh, that's nice. It shows me something that I would want for myself. So try and think of it that way, if you feel like you really envy something in someone, something they have, instead of feeling like, oh, they have it, therefore I can't have it, think that, oh, that's nice, that shows me that there's something in this person, whether there's a trait or something they have that I want. But for God's sake, be mindful of healthy, envy. For instance, like, oh, I noticed this person has a really interesting job, I also would love an interesting job, versus the eating disorder coming in and thinking, oh, this person is really thin, this person goes to the gym a lot, you should, because that is the disorder. And also ask yourself, is this in alignment with your values? What are your values? What do you value in the people around you? And also, even though admiring other people and what they have can be nice sometimes and can also help kind of you finding out what are your values, what do you kind of aspire for, be careful, right? Because I feel sometimes society kind of prescribes to us what we should be envious of or what we should value, right? So be mindful, like, is it your values or is it society's values that you just kind of like, what can I say, internalized? So for example, if you really feel like it's very important for you to have a certain body, is that really you, or is it society's values that you've internalized, or is it the eating disorders value that you've internalized? And I want to remind you that finding your identity after something like an eating disorder and rediscovering yourself, it is a process. You do not need to wake up one morning and just, you know it all, you know exactly who you are, you know? I always say that I don't really believe in finding yourself, I believe in creating yourself. And recovery gives you a bit of a blank canvas. Like when you have recovered from eating disorder, you've taken away a part of your identity that was taking up a lot of time and a lot of space, just because an eating disorder is so invasive, right? It just becomes the focal point of your brain. I remember myself, like when I had my eating disorder, I could not really be present or focus on anything else, right? So you've kind of removed that tumor, right? And then, you know, you might be left feeling very empty, because even though the eating disorder was not like a nice visitor, right? It still took up a lot of space and a lot of energy, a lot of time, right? And now you don't have that. And now it's like, what now? You know, this feels very empty. And I think this is where a lot of people get so tempted to fill up this void so quickly that they jump into something that feels safe and familiar, but often in a less, what can I say? It's kind of like the eating disorder but camouflage, right? So for example, someone might go from an eating disorder to a hyper obsession with fitness or hyper obsession with eating a specific way, right? Because it is something that's more socially acceptable, but it is a way to kind of quickly fill up the void from the eating disorder. That's kind of the underlying thing, right? And that's why I'm always saying, be a bit mindful of these drastic, you know, changes right after recovery. And also throughout recovery, some people might want to do these changes during recovery. It might be like, I can only recover if I do it this specific way or follow this specific lifestyle. And very unfortunately, like some of the I would almost say cult leaders in certain like lifestyle movements. So, you know, because it can be very culty. Let's face it, some of these movements are really culty. They kind of prescribe those solutions as a solution, as like the solution to the eating disorder, right? They prescribe that, okay, if you start eating this way, your eating disorder will go away. If you start training this way, your eating disorder will go away. And I offer you that community. So it can be very, very tempting. But I'm just saying, as someone who worked with people who've gone into that trap, be careful, because I work with the people who've gone in the trap and then they come out months or years even later. And then they're like, oh, damn it. That was not me. I was being tricked. This was not me. So yeah, as I said, creating yourself rather than finding yourself. Yes, some of what I spoke about is kind of like finding yourself, such as like knowing your values, right? But also, I believe that this is a process that's best done with trial and error, right? You try things and then you realize, is this for me? Is this not for me, right? You can't just sit there and kind of meditate and hope that suddenly you just get some like revelation that this is me, this is my path, this is what I'm doing, right? That's not usually how it works. You know, the road is being made whilst you're busy getting lost. That's my dad's expression. Maybe someone else, maybe he stole it from someone, I don't know. But he always tells me that, and I think it's so true. Like the path to where I am now, it was a messy path. Oh my God, with many, many detours. But those detours were not mistakes. Those detours were part of my character development. So I would encourage you, spend less time just trying to sit there and think, who am I? What should I do? And just get out and do it, right? Get out and do things, you know? Say yes to joining that course or seeing that friend, right? You don't need to know until when you've done it, then you get maybe a feeling like, oh yeah, this was for me, or this was not for me at all. Because life is gonna happen regardless what you fill it with. Life is gonna happen. And you learn so much also from the, detours. And also sometimes the detours can take you to wonderful destinations. And now I also want to talk quickly a little bit about, the over-identification with the eating disorder. And this especially goes to people maybe they've had eating disorder for some time and they maybe have become, some people call it like institutionalized. I don't know if I like that word. But basically they've been in the treatment system for a very long time and they kind of have very often also been almost given up on by the treatment system, kind of just labeled like a chronic case or like, I heard some people say like revolving door patient because they keep going in and out of the hospital or, treatment, psychologist, they never quite get out of it, right? And first of all, I want to say, if you fall in that group, I refuse to use the word chronic case and I refuse to use any of these terms. I just think that like these terms can be quite stigmatizing and can really it's not exactly very hopeful being called these things, right? And your eating disorder loves any kind of, reason why you can't recover. So I would hold on to it for dear life and be like, no, you can't recover. You're a chronic case, right? So I don't believe in using those words. This is not to say that there are some people who struggle more with recovery than others. Don't get me wrong. But I've seen a lot of people that have been given up on or labeled chronic and just be like, yeah, you're always going to be this way, actually recover. So I will always have faith in people, no matter how long they've been ill. Anyways, so if you are someone who finds yourself over-identifying with, identity of illness, it can be helpful to kind of do a bit of the things that I said earlier, like, when you look at other people that you admire, do you admire them for their diagnosis or no diagnosis? Do you admire them for their illness, Is that how you want to be remembered? And if that's how you want to be remembered, why? Because sometimes I see that people hold, they find safety in the suffering identity because they feel like it gives them a reason not to try, right? It's kind of like, for instance, I'm not successful or any of these things because of my illness. But if I didn't have the illness as this shield and I still wasn't successful, then who would I blame? What if I recover and fail, right? And then the eating disorder can feel like almost like a safety net in that way. But this safety net is choking you. It is not safe. And I also wonder if this ties in with the eating disorder perfectionism, right? And this fear of failure that's very common. So I see a lot of perfectionism, eating disorder, rigidity. It's very like all or nothing mindset. Like either I must recover and be the most successful, amazing person ever, or I'll stay sick and be like the most sick person, right? It's this very like extreme black and white thinking. And I want to encourage you to also find some comfort in the gray, right? The truth is, most of us, we are quite average in most of the things we do. This was such a relief for me to realize, most of the things I do in my life, I'm pretty average at. And then there are like a few things that I'm like above average in, right? And you also will have a lot of things that you're probably quite average at, but then you will have a few strengths as well. And it's about finding and identifying those strengths. It's completely unrealistic being amazing at everything and succeeding at everything you're doing. And again, you don't learn if you only succeed. I have gotten to where I am through a lot of failures, and I embrace that. One thing that I hear from the people who, report feeling like that, because again, I'm saying these are people who report that they're over-identifying with the eating disorder or the illness. I'm not saying you do this, you do that, it's more people who actually come to me and say that, hey, I noticed that I over-identify with my illness and I have a hard time letting go of being, for instance, the anorexic one or the sick one, And one thing I often hear from this group is that they say that recovering, they kind of miss, the care and concern that they feel like they're getting. Could be from family, could be from treatment professionals, but very often it's like family, partner, friends. And I completely hear that. But I also want to remind you of one thing, and that is that this concern, even though it can maybe feel like care and concern, it can very often turn into almost resentment. And people kind of shaking their heads a bit behind your back. Because the brutal truth is that for a lot of people, their patience runs out a bit. And even though they might act compassionate, they're a little bit like, I hear this a lot. There's like a bit of like why, And that's not really a nice feeling. Is it a nice feeling being, someone kind of, I guess, not pitying you, but, being kind of like, they're nice, but they're also a little bit like, shaking their heads? It's not a nice feeling being seen or treated like that by people. So there might be care and concern, but it can often come with a side dish of a slight resentment. Again, this is not the case for all, but I'm just saying this is something I've seen in general. And also, I work with like families and other practitioners, and it's something I see quite a bit. And it's not necessarily a good thing, but it's a very human thing. And I guess what I also want to ask you is, okay, so this identity you have now, this over-identification with being, the sick one. Is it giving you the life you want? Are you happy with it? Because if you were happy with it, why would you listen to this episode? There's probably a part of you that's unhappy with it and feel like this is not quite fulfilling. It might feel safe, but what feels safe can sometimes be the most dangerous. You were not brought on this planet to be the sickest or having the saddest story. You were not brought on this planet to carry your suffering like a badge of honor, because that is a very heavy badge of honor and there's no honor in it. What I would say is recovery can give you an accomplishment and make you feel like a certain strength that you can utilize in your future. I always say this to my clients, that if you get through this, right, come out on the other side, you would have learned so much. You would have had so many strengths that you acquired through recovery. That accomplishment is something you can take into so many other arenas in your life. And this is not to say like, oh, so you're saying that that suffering with an eating disorder is a good thing because it's character development. That is not at all what I'm saying at all. But we also can't completely throw away the concept of post-traumatic growth, right? When you are experiencing something traumatic and you manage to grow from it. And post-traumatic growth and finding meaning and learning something from what you've gone through is actually associated with better, outcomes. So if you manage to create some kind of like meaning or story or narrative that's helpful to you about something that happened to you, this can really, really aid in your recovery. So think of what you're learning in recovery. What strengths are you having to really play on in your recovery? And how can you use those strengths in other arenas? For example, maybe recovery is a process where you have to let go of a lot of control and you have to trust the process. You have to be more trusting of maybe your therapist or whoever you're working with. To trust the process and trust an invisible outcome in the future that you can't yet see. Being more trusting the process and, taking a leap of faith, that's a very good strength that you can use in so many other areas, right? Or maybe recovery teaches you to be very determined and resilient, right? Those are good traits that you can use in so many other areas. So overall, today I want you to think a bit, who am I? And also, not just who am I, but who do I want to be? Because honestly, I feel like this is all like a simulation. We're literally just all like put here and just to do whatever we want, like Sims walking around. Like, nothing is real anyways. Why not just do it, right? I know that sounds really silly, but that actually calms me down so much to think about. When I just think, nothing is real anyways. This is all just a mess, right? This makes no sense. It motivates me to just do things and not overthink and just do. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And now I'm going to answer a listener question. So this person, I'm again paraphrasing, is saying that they're concerned because they're finding themselves eating only sweets and not eating any vegetables, and is wondering if this is okay. I get a lot of variations of this question where someone is, I'm only eating, and then they mention specific foods, usually foods that are high sugar, high calorie, like processed foods, and then they're concerned because that is mainly what they're craving, and then they don't really notice that they're craving foods that they feel like they should eat, such as vegetables. And here's the thing. In recovery, and also life in general, healthy is very relative. If you're someone in recovery from an eating disorder and you're working on challenging your fear foods, then that is the healthiest thing you can do. If you're terrified of eating a burger, the burger is the healthiest thing. So that is mentally, right? But also I want to remind you that physically, an undernourished body, and please keep in mind that undernourishment can happen at any size, right? You don't need to be clinically underweight to be undernourished, but an undernourished body that is desperate for fuel, it is a lot healthier to eat the higher calorie option that gives you more, energy for the food rather than filling up on vegetables that are very low energy. And I always advocate for in recovery, like, there's no need to excessively fill up on vegetables. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying you can't eat vegetables because, vegetables are nice, but in recovery, you need to actually get a sufficient amount of calories, and foods such as, for instance, high sugar foods, highly processed foods, high carb, high fat, this is usually what the body actually wants. Your body is not stupid. Your body is very smart. Your body is like, hey, This is what we need. And also, this is probably something you've been depriving yourself of. It's completely normal and expected that those are the kind of foods you will crave. And yes, it is completely fine for you to eat that. You don't need my permission. So I don't want to feel like you need to ask me for permission before eating anything. But I do want to remind you that it's completely normal in recovery to crave foods that maybe you feel are not quote unquote healthy. Oh, I hate that word. But for you, those foods would be the healthiest option. And funnily enough, what I very often see with people in recovery is that when they allow themselves to eat those foods, right? Those foods that they've been banning themselves from, the foods that they really crave, and eventually they let themselves eat them freely. And then there's a period of time where that's kind of all they want, right? And then eventually they wake up one day and suddenly they actually notice that I kind of crave vegetable again, you know? I noticed this for myself. Like my cravings would be mostly, I was so obsessed with like pasta especially. And then I didn't really crave like fruits, vegetables, any of that. And then one morning I woke up and I was like, wow, I really crave an apple, right? And it's important to say, be mindful of cravings versus eating disorder desires, right? Because one thing is desiring an apple because it's a safe food. Another thing is generally like, oh, a nice crispy apple, that would be nice. And feeling like you crave that over something else, right? Oh, and I know how difficult it can be to separate cravings from eating disorder desires. That's a whole other episode. But anyways, the foods that you have deprived yourself from tends to be the foods you crave in recovery. Best way to get over that is to eat them. The foods you tend to crave in recovery also tend to be foods that are very often, high energy, high carbohydrate, and there's also high fat. And this is because these are energy-dense foods that you really need. And also, they're easily digestible, especially processed foods. They're easy to digest, right? If you're eating broccoli, that is a lot of work for the stomach. If you're eating, for instance, like grabbing some McDonald's fries, right? That is something that's a lot easier for the body to break down and take energy from. Essentially, eating these foods is not just that it is okay. I would actually say it's a great thing because you're challenging the eating disorder mentally and physically you're giving your body the energy it desperately needs. So it's two birds in one stone. What is so ironic here is that even though I just explained that, your eating disorder will still tell you that, yeah, not for you though. That's not the case for you. Other people, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, what Amalie is saying makes sense. Not for me though. I need to eat that quinoa salad instead of the fries that I really want. And I mean, not to be arrogant, but if we look at like the track records your eating disorder have versus me, again, I'm not saying I'm always right, but I do think on recovery things, probably I'm a little bit more right than your eating disorder, don't you think? Again, you know yourself best. I'm not saying that I know you better than you know yourself because I don't. But is your eating disorder a reliable source of recovery information? And how has listening to your eating disorder worked so far? Maybe trying the opposite could be a good thing. So yeah, long story short, yes, it's completely normal not to crave vegetables in recovery. No, you will not develop some kind of deficiency or, God, people have a lot of conspiracy about what's going to happen if they don't like fill like half their plate with vegetables, which it's just not realistic, right? It's not how our bodies and nutrition work. You will not suffer from going through a period where, certain foods are more tempting than the fruit and vegetables. Completely normal. And you will notice as you are actually just allowing yourself to eat what you crave, you will notice that suddenly you'll start craving more different kinds of foods again, Now, I want to grab like maybe some vegetable soup, and the next day I want to eat pizza, right? I don't think I need to eat the vegetable soup because it has a lot of vegetables, right? It's actually just more like a craving, It's like because my body knows what it wants. Trust your body, trust the process. That is the key takeaway here. Okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed this slightly longer than average episode, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week. And as usual, sorry for the shameless self-promotion here. If you like this episode, feel free to rate it, share it with a friend or an enemy or whoever you want. See you guys.